Hello everyone, and welcome back to my library. She's recovered from laryngitis, but now she's caught COVID, and today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. You have no idea how excited I am to be starting my Squarespace website again. Squarespace is more than just, a website builder. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to curate and build a beautiful online presence and also run a business. If you're someone who sells things online, you can have your whole hub in one spot with a Squarespace website. Squarespace membership areas allow you to sell your courses through a membership area. And on the flip side, you can also sell your products on there. Or if you're a writer who wants to make money from your writing, you can actually release your book chapter by chapter. And there's a donation button where fans can tip you and donate for the pages that you're releasing. But if you're interested in the possibility of tapping into a passion project of yours and making money from it, then you can use my code Lady of the Library for 10% off your first purchase of a domain or a website. The link is in the description. It is squarespace.com/Lady of the Library, or use my code Lady of the Library at checkout for 10% off. Thank you so much, Skillshare, for sponsoring today's video. You have no idea how happy I am with this partnership. I can't wait to show you my website. But until then, let's get into the video all about mermaids. Hello everyone, and welcome to my Dark History series. Throughout the season, my videos will be honouring the dark and monstrous side of ancient history and mythology. My name is Chinsia, and together we shall dive back into the depths of the sea to uncover ancient stories in part 2 of the Mermaid and Siren saga. We all know that the little mermaid that we're so fond of in fairy tales has her own dark and disturbing story, but her origins in terms of mythology and folklore are equally as sinister, and they go back centuries. Following on from my last video about sirens, you're probably wondering how the demonic, monstrous, sailor-hunting bird woman we know as the sirens metamorphosed into the seductive yet harmless mermaids that we know of today. Well, they didn't actually technically metamorphose as such, but they amalgamated with the fish-tailed people. But the fish-tailed people already existed. In fact, to go and find our first ever mer-person, we have to go back over 7,000 years ago, where the Babylonians honoured a merman named Ea, who is also known as Enki to the Sumerians, and later known as Agnes to the Greeks, though some believe that Agnes is a missionary to Ea. Agnes is reputed to have risen from the Erythraean Sea, and taught man the arts and sciences. According to the Babylonian priest, Berossus had the form of a fish, but with the head of a man under his fish's head and human feet underneath his fish's tail. We only have fragments of Agnes, primarily from the 3rd century BCE priest Berossus. One fragment reads, "At first they had led a somewhat wretched existence and lived without rule after the manner of beasts. But in the first year after the flood appeared an animal endowed with a human reason, named Agnes, who rose out of the Erythraean Sea at the point where it borders Babylonia. He had the whole body of a fish, but above his fish's head he had another head, which was that of a man, and human feet emerged from beneath his fish's tail. He had a human voice, and an image of him is preserved unto this day. He passed the day in the midst of men without taking food. He taught them the use of letters, sciences, and the arts of all kinds. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, and to compile laws, and explained to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth, and showed them how to collect the fruits. In short, he instructed them on everything which we tend to soften human manners and humanize their laws." From that time, nothing material had been added by way of improvement to his instructions, and when the sun set, this being, Agnes, retired again into the sea, for he was amphibious. You can see also here a connection between sea people and the obsession with Atlanteans and all that jazz, which I'm covering in a different series entirely. But going back to the topic at hand, compared to their siren cousins, the Merman, as you can see here, was very far from horrific or a frightening monster. Instead, he was an aid to the humans. He was a teacher, a philosophical figure of sorts. And in the Louvre today, there is an 8th century wall scene depicting Agnes as a merman with a fish-like tail and his upper body as a human man. The Greeks and Romans adopted this figure into their gods, Poseidon and Neptune, though these gods were largely depicted as looking entirely human. The real Merman of Greek mythology comes from the marriage of Poseidon and Amphitrite. You see, their son, Triton, was a merman who, according to Hesiod, dwelt in a golden palace with his parents under the sea. Triton's character maintained Oannes' helpful nature, which we see in the story of the Argonauts, where Triton guides the Argonauts through the perilous journey. However, he metamorphoses and gets a slightly different, more dangerous reputation in the Middle Ages. According to a Danish ballad, Triton assumes the shape of a handsome knight to attend a church to abduct a beautiful princess within it. In some versions, she's successfully kidnapped, whilst in another Danish ballad, one which is taken from a German one called Agnes and the Merman, or rather Agnete. I'm going to say Agnes because I can't pronounce Agnete correctly. So in this one that's taken from the German, it says, Agnes, she walked on the edge of the steep, and up came the merman out of the deep. Ha ha ha. Up came the merman out of the deep. I'm not going to say this whole thing. Could you imagine if I sat here laughing like, ha ha ha. Anyway, as it was an oral story, the versions of it change, and in some versions, Agnes is abducted, in others she goes very willingly, and in a particular ballad, the merman takes her down beneath the sea, where she bore him 7 sons. But one day, when she hears the bell of England ring, I don't know why it's in here, England, okay? But basically she hears the bell of England ring, and she asks permission to go up to the kirk to pray. The merman gives her permission, but when she doesn't return to him, he suddenly desperately follows her to the kirk and begs her to return. Heed now, Agnes, what I say to thee. Thy little children are longing after thee. Let them long as they will, and let their longing be sore. Oh, think of the grown ones, and think of the small, of the baby in the cradle, and most of all. I think not of the grown ones, and not yet of the small. Of the baby in the cradle, I'll think least of all. I know, heartless woman, sounds exactly like me if I were a parent. I'd be like, nope, this is why I'm not having children. Anyway, if this actual song, ballad, sounds familiar to you, that's because many believe it to be the original ballad of the Matthew Arnold's well-known poem, The Forsaken Merman. So where do mermaids come into the picture? Well, the first ever mermaid on record is actually Syria's goddess Atargatis, and she, like the famed Little Mermaid of folklore today, has quite a sad story. However, the ancient story actually reverses the fairy tale of Hans Christian Andersen, or rather, he reversed the ancient tale. Atargatis is referred to by multiple names. The Greeks call her Dekito, and the Romans called her Dea Syria, or Deusura as one word. But for the ease of discussing her today, I shall just call her Atargatis. According to Diodorus Siculus, the goddess Atargatis fell in love with a beautiful human youth named Simios, but also he's called Ichthys, which means fish. And with him she bore a daughter. However, becoming ashamed of her illicit love, Atargatis killed her lover. Then she left her daughter to die by exposure to the sun, and then flung herself into a lake near Ashkelon with the intention of drowning herself. However, rather than dying, her body was changed into the form of a fish, and her head remained human. In Diodorus' version of the legend, Atargatis' daughter was raised by doves in the desert, and she grew up to be Semiramis, the legendary Assyrian queen. What's important to note here is that Atargatis was renowned for her beauty, so much so that she was likened to Aphrodite, and this is likely where we developed the idea of the beautiful mermaid. We all know that the Greeks loved young, beautiful, naked women, and they leapt at the opportunity to bring one into their mythology. Thus enter the sea nymphs, and one in particular known as the Nereids, i.e. the daughters of the shape-shifting god Nereus. Unlike the sirens, the Nereids were the protectors of sailors and fishermen, and they represented all the treasures of the ocean. Although there are 50 Nereids, only 2 are well known today. Thetis, who's known as Achilles' mother and the unofficial leader of the Nereids, and Amphitrite, who we already discussed as being the mother of Triton. Roman historian Pliny the Elder describes the Nereids as half women, half fish, though the human half was still rough all over with scales. Interestingly enough, however, Pliny the Elder stresses that mermen are different from mermaids, as the former were apparently known to climb onto the ships and cause them to sink. Yes, they were little rascals. Interestingly, but related, we're going on a little bit of a diversion. The Nereids are a type of nymph, but they have a more demonic evolution when Orthodox Christianity entered the picture. According to the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Nereids were seductive but malicious female spirits who belonged to a larger classification of supernatural, which are known as exotica, meaning things from the outside, which now includes things like vampires, fairies, ghosts, and elves, etc. As with all religions, the Orthodox faith is not homogeneous. Faith has various layers to it, old and new. However, official Orthodox Christianity comprises principles that theologians and church fathers formulated over many years, with the aim of wiping out traces of paganism that arose in ancient Greece and were grafted into Christianity during the first 2 centuries of the Byzantine Empire. Although the church considered the exotica to be superstitious, the clergy did not distinguish them from legitimate Christian Orthodox ideas about the devil and demons. However, in comparison, according to the Greeks, the nymphs in general possessed powers of divination and were described as prophetic and oracular, but were reasonably harmless. Some also believed that nymphs were capable of bestowing powers upon the mortals. A state called nympholepsy referred to, quote, the heightening of awareness and elevated verbal skills believed to result from the nymph's influence on a susceptible individual. The person that would be influenced by the nymph would be known as a nympholept, and this state was described as madness, but it was a desirable madness, and that was actually seen as an extreme symbol of worship and power of the nymphs. But this is important because it leads us into the more renowned two-tailed mermaid or siren that we all know of, that adorns the cups of our beloved pumpkin spice lattes. Well, this specific mermaid story hails from northern and western France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. At the turn of the 14th century to the 15th century, 2 versions of the legend of Mélusine appeared, and the first was by Jean d'Arras, 1393 to 1394, with another penned by Coutret sometime in the opening years of the 15th century. According to the story, Mélusine was the daughter of the King of Scotland and a fairy whom he met in the woods and asked for her hand in marriage. The fairy agreed to marry the King of Scotland on one condition, that he never look at her when she was bathing their children. The King of Scotland agrees, and the pair have triplet daughters. But the babies needed washing, obviously quite frequently. They're babies, they poop everywhere, and the King of Scotland was a little bit curious as to why he couldn't see his little 3 daughters bathing. So one day, he broke his promise to the fairy, and the fairy immediately left him, taking the triplets with her to the lost Isle of Avalon. The 3 girls were called Mélusine, Mélieu, and Palatine. Mélusine was the oldest of the triplets. She was born first, and that meant a lot, according to the story. And she was dangerously curious about her origins. Ooh, what other little mermaid is dangerously curious about something else? And one day, she asks her mother, why were they taken to Avalon and where was her father? And upon hearing how her father broke the promise to her mother, Mélusine grew enraged and decided to take revenge. Clearly, blowing things out of proportion runs in the family. So Mélusine, with the help of her sisters, tracked down their father and they locked him up, riches and all, into a mountain. The fairy mother, Pressine, was furious when she found out and heard what her daughters had done, and she punished them all. Mélusine's punishment was that she were to transform from the waist down into a serpent or a fish every Saturday. I'm presuming this was to prevent her from going clubbing. Darn you, mother. Well, as in every archetypal medieval story, a poor but noble gentleman called Raymond was out hunting in the forest, and it was there that he saw Mélusine, with her flowing golden hair and glimmering white dress, sitting by a fountain. Much like her father to her mother, Raymond immediately fell in love with Mélusine and asked her to marry him, and she agrees on one condition. He never comes to see her on Saturdays. After that, Mélusine went to live with Raymond in the region of Poitou, near central western France, and using her magic, she developed cities and castles, including her own Château de Lusignan. She bore Raymond 10 sons, but they were pretty damn different. Each of them were kind of obviously strange in their appearances. They were very diverse, and they weren't all exactly very normal human looking, which raised suspicions with the king. You see, some of the sons were very lovely and nice, whilst others were a little bit more evil in nature. And on top of that, Mélusine was buggering off every Saturday, so the king was pretty damn concerned, and he had a feeling that there was some infidelity going on. So one Saturday, he peered through the keyhole of her magical chamber and saw her metamorphosis. There she was, splashing around in her bath, combing her hair, whilst a massive tail shot up to the ceiling, playing with the water. The spying on her in the bath links back to her ancient Greek ancestors, the Nymphs. You see, we all know about the famous myth of Actaeon, as told by Ovid, the hunter who accidentally came across the goddess Diana bathing with her nymphs. And he's punished for seeing them bathing by being turned into a stag and then being hunted down by his own dogs. Though the nymphs themselves were non-violent, their reputation has been skewed post-antiquity. For example, the term nymphomaniac is used for an individual who suffers from sexual drive that is considered abnormally high. This family of words has perhaps been taken from the term nymphid, which was coined by Vladimir Nabokov in the novel Lolita. Nabokov used this term to reference a young girl who was considered overly sexual, precocious and suggestive. The term nymph can also refer to an immature insect having not yet completed metamorphosis, which may have been etymologically derived from the ancient connotations of youth and having one's whole life ahead of them. After this transition, during the first 2 years of the Byzantine, nympholepsy stopped being interpreted as a desirable state of madness and instead referred to as a dangerous one. As Larson writes, in the post-classical period, possession by the nymphs began to be seen as an abnormal and dangerous state of hardly distinguishable from illness, and this idea is the direct precursor of the fear prominent in modern Greek folklore of being beaten or stricken by the nymphs. So nymphs, as you can see, have gone through a turmoil of perceptions. But let's go back to Daras's story of Mélusine. So she finds out that he peeped on her in the bath, and she actually forgives him for this transgression. However, then one of her not so nice sons kills one of the nice sons, and Raymond publicly denounces Mélusine, blaming his son's monstrous nature on her monstrous nature. As he denounces her in front of the entire court of people, he calls her a serpent, and somehow this proclamation triggers something in her mother's curse, and Mélusine transforms into a dragon and then flies away, only returning periodically to keep watch of her remaining sons and foretell the death of each of them. As you can tell from the title of the castle and all that jazz, and the actual locations, this story is connected with the northern areas of France, Poitou, and the Low Countries, as well as Cyprus, where the French Lusignan royal house ruled the island from 1192 to 1489, and they themselves claimed to be descendants from Mélusine. An oblique reference to this is actually made by Sir Walter Scott, who told the Mélusine tale in the Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border 1802 to 1803, stating that the reader will find the fairy of Normandy or Bretagne adorned with all the splendour of Eastern description. The fairy Mélusine, who married Guy de Lusignan, Count of Poitou, under the condition that he should never attempt to intrude upon her privacy, was the latter class. She bore the Count many children and erected for him a magnificent castle by her magical art. Their harmony was uninterrupted until the prying husband broke the conditions of their union by concealing himself to behold his wife and make use of her enchanted bath. Hardly had Mélusine discovered the indiscreet intruder before she transformed into a dragon and departed with a loud yell of lamentation. She was never visible to mortal eyes again, although even in the days of Brantôme, she was supposed to have been a protectress of her descendants, and was heard wailing as she sailed upon the blast round the turrets of the castle of Lusignan the night before it was demolished. Though I know exactly what you're thinking. Interesting story, Cinzia, but why the hell has she got 2 tails? Nowhere in that story is she mentioned as having 2 tails. Well, she's not, but this is where alchemy enters the chat. You see, alchemically speaking, the siren's 2 tails represent unity of earth and water. body and soul, and the vision of the universal Mercury, the all-pervading anima mundi, that calls out and makes the philosopher yearn for her. The Woman's Dictionary of Symbols and Sacred Objects points out that a double-tailed siren, a Baobu siren, is the cross between the mermaid and the Shilanagig, and according to them, the suggestive pose refers to the feminine sexual mysteries at the lure of temptation for the simple-minded fellow. The Shilanagig, for those unfamiliar, is rooted in paganism and the worship of evil spirits. Basically, it's a massive vulva that's opening itself up. Anyway, as Ridley Elms explains, the alchemal Mélusine serves as a bridge between the visible and the invisible, between the explicable and the inexplicable, between immortality and humanity, and between the sacred and the profane. In representing the mingling of the natural and supernatural worlds and the fairy and the ordinary, Mélusine ultimately figures both the union of the pagan and the Christian beliefs and the transformation of the pagan symbol of the siren into a Christian one of duality and enlightenment. Physicians in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, like Paracelsus 1493 to 1541, developed Mélusine into an alchemical symbol as part of what Philip Ball calls chemical theology. The Lusignans were not the only family to claim to be descendants of Mélusine. There was the Luxembourg family who claimed to descend from her through their ancestor Siegfried. So according to this story, in 963 CE, Count Siegfried of the Ardennes bought the feudal rights of the territory on which he founded the capital of Luxembourg, and from here his name is connected to the local version of the Mélusine tale. So this Mélusine, like her French counterpart, developed the city using her magic, including the castle of Luxembourg on the Bock Rock, the historical centre point of Luxembourg City, which she built the morning after her wedding day. However, like Raymond, her husband Siegfried caved into his curiosity and spied on her in the bath on the forbidden day. Though, instead of forgiving him, in this tale, Mélusine's bath immediately sank into the rock of the earth, taking her down with it. She only ever resurfaced every 7 years, either as a beautiful woman or a serpent, and every time she would resurface, she would have a golden key in her mouth, and whoever could take the key from her mouth could set her free and could claim her as their bride. This story is actually very similar to the legend of Hippocrates' daughter, also known as the Lady of the Land or the Lady of Langho, or also the daughter of Hippocrates. This is a tale from the 14th century book, The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, which itself has very uncertain origin. Allegedly, it details the adventures of an English knight, Sir John Mandeville, who travelled through India and China and across the world, though it resembles Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in many ways, though it's technically framed as a travelogue. Now I know what you're thinking. Hippocrates lived in the 4th century BCE, meaning there was no way in hell a knight would have ever crossed paths with him. But the Lady of Langho could be viewed as a proto-horror story, in which the hapless young woman is transformed against her will, and everyone who ever tries to help her runs from the sight of her. According to the story, the physician Hippocrates, who's the originator of the Hippocratic Oath, had a daughter who was so lovely that she rivaled the denizens of Olympus itself. Don't they all? Though for a change in this story, it wasn't actually Venus or Aphrodite who was jealous of her beauty, but the goddess Diana. And in her jealousy, she transformed the girl into a horrifying dragon. In this tale, she could only reclaim her human form for 3 days of the year, and she could only retain this human form if a knight successfully kissed her. In the story, there are 2 attempts. The first knight, who comes to save her, fails miserably because his horse, at the sight of her being a dragon, bolts it and jumps off a cliff, killing them both immediately. Then, the second man, who comes to inadvertently rescue her, is not a knight at all, but a sailor who's docked on the shore. He was just wandering around the castle out of curiosity, and he comes across her bedroom, and he just so happened to come when she was a human, and here she is, this beautiful woman surrounded by treasure. He immediately comes to the obvious conclusion that she's a prostitute, and then he asks her politely if he could be one of her clients. I suppose if you haven't seen someone for a long time, you kind of look past the inferences of that claim, and immediately she jumps to the opportunity of being rescued. So she asks the sailor, "Are you a knight?" to which he said no. So she demands that he goes off and gets knighted before kissing and potentially shagging him. A bit confused, the sailor goes down to his ship and he convinces his captain to knight him. If only being knighted was such an easy thing. However, he's a bit dense and he doesn't realise how much time he actually has because he decides to sleep on it. And the next day, he comes and lo and behold, she's turned herself back into a dragon. Or rather, she's transformed back into a dragon. So the next morning he comes to her, sees that she's a dragon and frickin' legs it to save his life. She is actually desperate to try and save him, so she actually chases him to try and hunt him down, but he gets on that boat and sails away. And the Lady of Lanco remains trapped in her bestial form to this very day, according to the legend. No one was ever brave enough to kiss her, except perhaps Donkey from Shrek. If only those two tales would collide. However, until that day comes, she sits in her curse, tormented for all eternity. Mélusine had quite an impact on a lot of famous literary figures in our time. I mean, for example, the German priest Martin Luther believed in the myth of Mélusine, but a slightly different version in which he referred to her as a succubus, obviously. There's also a tale written about her by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe in 1807, and that was published as part of a bigger collection, and the playwright Franz Georg Paser brought Goethe's tale to the stage, and Felix Mendelssohn published the concert overture, which is known as The Fair Melusina, in his opus 32. The Melusine legend is a variation of two different types of folktale. The first having to do with the lying in taboo, and the second to do with a swan maiden, or Valkyrie. Can you see where we're going here? You see, women in the Middle Ages were considered unclean after childbirth, and also too physically weak to resume their usual responsibilities for 10 to 20 days after giving birth. During this time, the husband was advised to leave her alone to be, and only be attended by female servants and female members of the family. If the husband didn't abide by these rules, bad luck was apparently said to follow. The swan maiden / Valkyrie motif comes from the Germanic and Norse mythology and involves a supernatural woman in the form of a swan who comes to bathe in a lake or stream, shedding her swan skin. Mélusine is one of the pre-Christian water fairies who were sometimes responsible for changelings and possibly also the Lady of the Lake, who spirited away the infant Lancelot and raised the child. But as you can tell, all of these are completely different folklore creatures and they deserve videos in their own right. And this is just a short version of it. I did not cover many mermaids out there, from Russian tales, Japanese tales, Korean, Chinese and Brazilian. There are a lot, so I'd have to cover those in a separate video, but I thought I was going a bit dense here, so I decided to cut it with this. So thank you so much for watching this second part of my new mythical history series, as it were. Thank you to all of my patrons for making this possible, and thank you in particular to my highest tier patrons, Crystal, Ashley, Eleanor, Janice, Doomed Days, Barbara, Arch Capitalist, Jack Manson, Chris, Robbie, Nicholas, Allison, Bill, Barbara, Laura and Andrea. Thank you all so much for being part of my Patreon, supporting me and making this whole series and my whole channel possible, and I will see you soon for another video in my October series. And remember, be happy, be healthy, and books save lives, so keep reading.